Paranormal and Haunted Technology Chapter 1, The Beginning of an Ordinary Life. Timothy Tim O'Connell was born on a stormy night in 1995, the kind of night that had the neighbors gossiping about omens and bad luck. His mother, Margaret, held him close as the wind howled outside, and she joked, "Well, Tim, you've already got the perfect timing for a spooky story." Little did she know, that quip would turn out more accurate than anyone could have imagined. Tim grew up in a small, unassuming town where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a predictable pace. His father, Frank, was a hardware store owner, always fiddling with old tools and gadgets. He would often say, "Machines never die, Tim. They just change hands." His words lingered in Tim's mind as he grew older, though back then, they were just another piece of fatherly advice. As a child, Tim had an affinity for electronics. He'd spend hours tinkering with his father's discarded gadgets, fixing radios and televisions like it was second nature. By the age of 10, he was the go-to kid in the neighborhood if your Game Boy or VCR went on the fritz. His friends jokingly called him Tech Tim, but Tim never thought much of it. It was just what he loved to do. Life seemed normal enough until Tim's 13th birthday, the day he got his first smartphone. It wasn't much, just an old, second-hand flip phone that his parents could afford, but to Tim, it was like holding the future in his hands. It wasn't long before he discovered his love for apps and programming, and by the time he was in high school, he had taught himself to code. But even with his tech-savvy skills, strange things began to happen. His phone would buzz in the middle of the night with texts that had no sender. The messages were garbled, full of static and fragments of words. At first, he dismissed it as a glitch. After all, it was an old phone. But the disturbances would grow, becoming more sinister, as if something or someone was trying to communicate through his devices. Chapter 2, A Glitch in Reality. By the time Tim was 16, his fascination with technology had turned into a full-blown obsession. He spent more time online than he did with real people, diving into the depths of the web, learning the ins and outs of every new tech trend. His laptop was his closest companion, and social media became his stage. It was through this obsession that he stumbled upon The Loop. The Loop was an obscure app, rumored to be cursed, yet Tim, ever the skeptic, saw it as nothing more than an urban legend. The app promised to show users a glimpse into their future, but at the cost of, well, no one knew exactly what. It wasn't available on any official app store, and downloading it required following a series of bizarre steps involving encrypted links and mysterious forums. Tim, always up for a challenge, couldn't resist. He downloaded The Loop one late night, the eerie glow of his computer casting shadows across his room. The app was simple, just a black screen with a glowing red circle in the center. He pressed it, expecting nothing more than a hoax or a cheap scare. Instead, the app seemed to glitch out, the screen flickering before showing him a static-filled reflection of his own room, but slightly off. "That's weird," Tim muttered, shaking his head, but as he closed the app, his phone buzzed. It was a text message, yet again from no one. This time, it was clearer than the earlier ones, "Welcome to The Loop. Now, let's play." Tim's first reaction was to laugh. "Okay, that's clever," he said to himself, assuming it was some advanced prank app designed to mess with people's heads. But when his computer's screen suddenly turned off on its own, and his room lights flickered, he felt a chill. This wasn't normal. The next few days were filled with more strange occurrences. His devices began to act erratically, a phone's dialing numbers on their own, his laptop's webcam turning on by itself. Every time he logged onto social media, the same eerie message would appear: "You're in the loop now." Chapter 3: The app that wouldn't quit. Despite the unsettling occurrences, Tim couldn't stop himself from being drawn back to the loop. There was something inexplicably magnetic about it. Each time he reopened the app, it offered something new, a different eerie glimpse into his life, always showing a version of reality that wasn't quite right. He'd see his house, but with doors open that he was sure had been closed, his parents, but their faces blurred as if in a dream. One evening, Tim tried to delete the app. He was done with the jokes and the weird happenings, or so he told himself. He went through the usual steps: hold the icon, hit delete. But each time, the app reappeared moments later, as if it had never left. His phone would buzz again, another message from an anonymous source: "You can't leave the loop." No one ever does. Frustrated, Tim vented to his best friend, Sarah, over lunch at school. "I swear it's like my phone's haunted, Sarah. No matter what I do, this app won't go away." Sarah raised an eyebrow, half joking. "Maybe you should just throw it into a lake and call it a day. Or, I don't know, maybe the app's trying to hit on you. You've got that tech guy charm, after all." Tim chuckled. "Yeah, because nothing says a romance like a cursed app. Who needs Tinder when I've got the loop?" They both laughed, but Tim couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, things escalated. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing at odd hours, and every time he logged onto his computer, the app seemed to be there, waiting, no matter how many times he uninstalled it. Worse still, he started hearing static-filled whispers, like voices trapped within the circuits of his devices, speaking in tongues he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't until one particularly chilling night that Tim realized he was no longer in control. His phone buzzed on his nightstand at 3 a.m., waking him from a restless sleep. The message on his screen sent a shiver down his spine: "Look outside." Nervously, he glanced toward his window. Through the dim light, he could make out a faint, flickering figure standing just outside his house. A glitch in reality or something worse. Chapter 4: The haunting takes hold. Terrified, Tim blinked, hoping the figure outside his window was a figment of his overactive imagination. But as his phone buzzed again with the word "step outside," he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, but a strange pull, a curiosity laced with dread, drove him to approach the window. Tim opened the curtains to find the figure was still there, flickering like a digital ghost. It was as if some Enya or something had stepped out from the pixels of his screen and into the real world. The air around the figure seemed to hum with a static-like energy, making the hairs on Tim's arms stand on end. Without thinking, Tim grabbed his phone and took a picture. But when he looked at the screen, the figure wasn't there. Confused, he looked back out the window, and that's when the figure vanished entirely, leaving only the sound of static buzzing in his ears. Shaken, Tim slumped into his chair, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He stared at the Loop app, his heart pounding. There had to be a way out of this nightmare. He scoured the internet, looking for any mention of the app, any tips or tricks on how to delete it for good. But all he found were cryptic forums full of warnings: once you're in the loop, you're never truly free. Over the next few days, the hauntings intensified. His devices were no longer just acting erratically, they were actively working against him. His computer refused to shut down, instead playing eerie videos on a loop. His phone would call random numbers in the middle of the night, leaving garbled messages that no one could decipher. One afternoon, while walking home from school, Tim's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. "We see you," it read. Tim stopped dead in his tracks and looked around. The street was empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His phone buzzed again. "Behind you." Tim turned slowly, expecting to see some hyena or something standing there. But there was nothing, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. His heart raced, and for the first time in his life, Tim realized that this wasn't just a glitch or a prank. Something much darker was happening, and he was at the center of it. Chapter 5, The Ghost in the Machine. Determined to rid himself of the loop once and for all, Tim turned to the only person he thought might believe him: his father, Frank. Frank, a man who believed that machines had souls of their own, had always warned Tim that technology wasn't as harmless as it seemed. He often joked, "You treat a machine wrong, it'll haunt you forever." Tim never took those words seriously. Until now. One evening, after dinner, Tim sat down with his dad in the garage, where Frank was busy repairing an old radio. "Dad," Tim began hesitantly, "I think I'm being haunted." "By technology." Frank looked up from his work, a knowing smile on his face. "Ah, so you finally learned that lesson, huh? Machines aren't just tools. They've got their own kind of life. You've been messing with something that doesn't want to let go." Tim sighed, exasperated. "I didn't mean to. It's this up of the loop. It's doing things. Things I can't explain." Frank wiped his hands on a rag and nodded thoughtfully. "The loop, huh? Sounds like you've opened a door to something you weren't ready for. But don't worry, son. We'll figure this out." Together, they hatched a plan. Frank, being the tech enthusiast he was, had a collection of old equipment in the garage. He believed that by using some of the old, analog technology, they might be able to disrupt whatever force was behind the loop. "Sometimes, the old ways are the best ways," Frank said with a grin. As they worked, Frank told Tim stories about ancient spirits and curses that could inhabit even the most modern devices. "Technology may change, but spirits don't," he said, his tone serious. "They find new ways to reach us." Chapter 6, The Plan in Motion. Tim watched his father tinker with the old radio, feeling a strange mix of hope and fear. If anyone could figure this out, it would be Frank. He had spent years repairing broken things, whether it was cars, appliances, or the odd mechanical toy from Tim's childhood. But fixing a haunted app? This was uncharted territory, even for Frank. As they connected wires and adjusted dials, Tim asked, "So, what exactly are we doing here, Dad? How's an old radio going to help with an app?" Frank smiled without looking up. "This isn't just about the radio, Tim. We're creating interference. You see, spirits, whether they're stuck in an old house or haunting your fancy gadgets, thrive in places where energy flows smoothly. Disrupt that energy, and you mess with whatever's controlling them. Think of it like pulling the plug on a vacuum." Tim raised an eyebrow. "A vacuum? So, you're saying this ghost in my phone is just sucking up my energy?" Frank chuckled. "Not exactly, but you get the idea. Once we throw this thing off balance, it should give you the chance to get rid of the loop permanently. With the plan in motion, Tim felt a renewed sense of hope. But as the night wore on, the sense of being watched crept back into his mind. It wasn't just his imagination. The air in the garage felt thick, charged with an unseen presence. The dim light flickered, and the familiar hum of the old equipment suddenly took on an eerie tone. "Almost there," Frank muttered, adjusting the radio's frequency. "We're looking for the sweet spot. The right frequency should mess with whatever's haunting you." Just then, Tim's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. His heart pounded as he pulled it out, half expecting to see another cryptic message from the loop. But this time, the phone's screen was blank. No app, no icons, just static. For a moment, Tim felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What the?" Tim began, but Frank held up a hand. "Wait, Tim," Frank said, his voice calm but commanding. "This is exactly what we need. The interference is starting to work." The phone buzzed again, this time violently, and then went completely dark. The static disappeared. Tim stared at the blank screen, holding his breath. "Did it work?" Frank nodded slowly. "Maybe. But we're not done yet. We need to make sure." Chapter 7, Into the Eye of the Storm. Over the next few days, things seemed to calm down. Tim's phone was behaving normally, his laptop stopped playing eerie videos, and there were no more mysterious text messages or phantom calls. For the first time in weeks, Tim felt like his life was returning to normal. He even allowed himself to hope that the loop had been defeated. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was too easy. And as he went about his day, there were subtle hints that the nightmare wasn't over. He'd catch glimpses of flickering figures in the corner of his eye or hear faint whispers coming from his phone late at night. Nothing concrete, but enough to keep him on edge. One evening, as Tim sat at his desk, trying to focus on homework, his phone buzzed once again. He froze, staring at the screen. The familiar message popped up, "We're not finished yet." Tim's stomach dropped. He knew it was a mistake to think this was over. He rushed downstairs to the garage, where Frank was still fiddling with the radio. "Dad, it's back," Tim blurted out, panic rising in his voice. "The loop, it's still here." Frank turned to face him, his expression serious. "I was afraid of this. We've disrupted the connection, but we haven't severed it completely. Whatever's haunting your phone, it's found a way to hold on." Tim clenched his fists. "So what do we do now?" Frank thought for a moment before responding. "We need to take this to the next level." The radio was just the beginning. To truly break free, we're going to have to confront whatever's behind the loop directly. No more running. We're going into the eye of the storm. Tim swallowed hard. "What do you mean, confront it?" Frank's eyes darkened. "We're going to have to invite it in. Give it a space where it can manifest, and then we'll deal with it. But this won't be easy, Tim. You need to be ready for whatever happens next." Chapter 8, The Final Showdown. Later that night, Tim and Frank prepared for the final confrontation. Frank set up a space in the garage with a circle of old technology, radios, TVs, even an ancient landline phone designed to act as a conduit for whatever entity was haunting Tim's phone. Frank explained that by giving it a physical presence, they could trap it, contain it, and finally destroy it. Tim was nervous, to say the least. The idea of willingly summoning this digital ghost seemed insane, but he trusted his father. "So, what's the plan once this thing shows up?" Tim asked, eyeing the flickering TV set warily. Frank handed him an old handheld radio. "This is your weapon," he said with a grin. "Think of it like a ghost-busting vacuum cleaner. You tune it to the right frequency, and it should disrupt whatever's controlling the loop long enough for us to trap it." Tim couldn't help but laugh, despite his fear. "A vacuum cleaner? Really, Dad?" Frank shrugged. "It worked for ghosts in the 80s, didn't it?" As the clock struck midnight, they powered up the devices, filling the garage with the hum of electricity. The air grew thick again, and the lights dimmed. Tim's phone, which had been lying on the workbench, suddenly buzzed to life. The screen flashed, showing nothing but static, and then a single word appeared: "Hello." Tim's heart raced. "It's here." The devices around them crackled and hissed, and the air felt charged with something malevolent. The static from Tim's phone filled the room, and the once flickering images on the old TVs became clearer. They showed distorted figures, shadows of people, walking through empty streets, standing in abandoned rooms. It was as if the loop was pulling them into its world. Frank nodded to Tim, who gripped the radio tightly. "Now, Tim. Tune it. Break the connection." Tim took a deep breath and turned the dial on the handheld radio, searching for the frequency that Frank had set up earlier. The air around them vibrated, and the figures on the screens began to twitch and distort. The phone buzzed louder, the screen flashing erratically, as if it were fighting back. Then, the strangest thing happened. A voice came through the static. "Why are you trying to leave? You belong with us." Tim's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar. It wasn't some unknown entity, it was his own voice. The loop had been copying him, mimicking his thoughts, his fears. Frank shouted over the noise, "Don't listen to it, Tim. Keep going." With a determined twist of the dial, Tim found the right frequency. A high-pitched whine filled the room, and the figures on the TVs began to disintegrate, their forms breaking apart into static. The phone buzzed violently, shaking on the workbench. Tim focused on the radio, refusing to let the entity's words get to him. Suddenly, the phone's screen went dark, and the noise in the garage ceased. The air felt lighter, the tension gone. Tim let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Frank put a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, kid." Chapter 9, The Aftermath. In the weeks following the showdown in the garage, Tim's life returned to some semblance of normalcy. The haunting had stopped, and the loop was gone for good. Tim was finally free from the bizarre curse that had plagued his devices. But the experience had left its mark on him. He no longer spent hours glued to his phone or computer, and he was more cautious about the apps he downloaded. The digital world wasn't just a tool anymore, it was something that could bite back. Tim and his dad grew closer after the ordeal. They spent more time together, fixing up old electronics and talking about life. Frank would often joke, "Well, Tim, you survived a haunted app. I think you can handle anything now." Tim would laugh and respond, "Yeah, who needs horror movies when you've lived through one?" But there was always a small part of Tim that wondered if it was truly over. He couldn't help but glance at his phone sometimes, half expecting it to buzz with another cryptic message. He never told his dad, but the idea of something still lurking out there, in the circuits and code, never fully left his mind. One night, Tim was lying in bed, scrolling through his phone, when it buzzed. His heart skipped a beat as he saw an unknown notification. He tapped it nervously, but it was just an update for an app he'd forgotten he'd downloaded. He chuckled to himself and put the phone down. Maybe, just maybe, the haunting was over for good. Chapter 10, A New Beginning, continued. Years passed, and Tim moved on with his life. He went to college, studied computer science, and even started his own tech company. The experience with the loop never fully left him, but instead of haunting him, it became a story he told late at night to friends over drinks, always ending with, "I swear, it's true." The chilling tale of his digital haunting became something of a legend in his circle. But beneath the laughter and disbelief, Tim knew that he had narrowly escaped something far more sinister. Tim's company, ironically enough, specialized in cybersecurity and app development. He became obsessed with the unseen vulnerabilities in the digital world, the holes that could be exploited and not just by hackers but by forces far beyond human understanding. He developed software designed to protect against unknown threats, but in his heart, he knew he was building walls against more than just cyber attacks. There were still things out there, lurking in the digital shadows. His success didn't come without challenges. As his company grew, so did the pressure. Investors demanded results, and the tech world moved faster than ever. Tim found himself constantly connected, his life once again intertwined with the digital devices that had nearly destroyed him. But he was smarter now, warier. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, bathed in the glow of multiple monitors, he found himself reflecting on how far he had come. His thoughts drifted back to that fateful summer, the garage with his dad, and the strange connection between the supernatural and technology. He smiled at the memory of Frank's homemade ghost-busting radio, and the way they had stood together, facing down the unseen. His father had always believed in the old ways, and Tim now appreciated the wisdom in that. Just as he was about to pack up for the night, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen out of habit, expecting nothing more than a calendar reminder or a late-night email. But what he saw made his blood run cold. The notification on the screen was all too familiar. The loop. Tim's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the message. His fingers hovered over the phone, unsure whether to open it or toss it across the room. A part of him wanted to believe it was just a glitch, a cruel coincidence. But deep down, he knew better. The loop was back. He opened the message with trembling hands, and there it was, the same simple phrase that had started it all, years ago. "Welcome back." Tim stood frozen, his mind racing. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw something of his own reflection, distorted and shadowed, staring back at him from the depths of the phone. The voice in his head whispered, "You thought you were free. But no one ever truly escapes." But this time, Tim was ready. He wasn't a scared kid anymore, fumbling with his phone in the dark. He had spent years preparing for this moment, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. He quickly opened a program on his computer, the one he had designed for just this scenario. The software hummed to life, scanning the phone for any trace of the loop's presence. The program beeped, indicating it had found something, and Tim's heart skipped a beat. But instead of fear, he felt determination. He wasn't going to let this thing control his life again. With a few clicks, he initiated the purge. The screen of his phone flashed, the image of his distorted reflection briefly flaring before it was replaced with static. The phone buzzed and shook, as if resisting, but Tim held his ground. After a tense few moments, the phone went silent. The message was gone. The loop was gone. Tim let out a long breath, his hands shaking slightly as he set the phone down on his desk. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the now blank screen. Maybe it was truly over this time. Or maybe it wasn't. As he stood up to leave, he glanced at the framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of him and Frank, standing in the garage, covered in grease and grinning like idiots. His dad had taught him how to fix broken things, how to stand up to whatever came his way, and most importantly, how to believe in himself even in the face of the impossible. Tim smiled to himself as he switched off the lights and headed out of the office. Whatever came next, he was ready. Because sometimes, the old ways are the best ways. And sometimes, facing the ghosts of your past means knowing that they can't haunt you forever. Or maybe they can, but you learn how to live with them anyway. As he stepped out into the night, his phone buzzed one last time. He hesitated before pulling it out of his pocket, his breath catching as he read the final message. "We'll be seeing you." Tim laughed softly, shaking his head as he tucked the phone away. "Not today," he muttered, walking into the darkness with a smile. "Not today."